Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here. Enrico, it's lovely to see you at a distance. Thank you to everybody for having made me so welcome, and the organization has been brilliant. Thank you also to Lisa. You've been very patient with all my requests and questions and queries. It's been very good. If somebody can also just put in the chat box the time I'm supposed to finish so that I know that I get it right and I don't overrun and don't go to a time I shouldn't be at, that would be great. So when Enrica asked me to do this, so there's so many things I wanted to talk about because this notion of taking down silos is literally at the core of my heart. And it's such a brilliant topic for the conference. And I really didn't know what to talk about. I was kind of a little bit spoiled for choice. Some of you may know that more recently I've been researching compassion-based language education, and that's very much about social justice and breaking down silos within the classroom and beyond the classroom. So that was sort of one temptation. But as an academic conference, I decided to talk about interdisciplinarity. It's been something that has deeply affected all the work that I've done. I was thinking that if maybe there are early career scholars or people in different parts of the world in different positions, I know that this brings some challenges. So I thought maybe I'd talk a little bit about that, but I know that we have time at the end for a Q&A, so we can answer and talk about any of the other things that I've been working on if you're interested in that later. So let me just close. I've got so many little bits open with chat boxes and windows. There we go. That makes it a little bit easier. And I'm just going to move that and then I can see that better. Okay. So if you look at these fields, this whole notion of biodiversity, if you look at these fields, this beautifully manicured lawn, which of course looks nothing like my garden, and this beautiful flower field and meadow, which also looks nothing like my garden. But you know which is better for wildlife. You know which of these is going to be more fertile ground and which is better for biodiversity and better for growth, and also which, in my opinion, looks more beautiful. And so we start to understand that diversity is a strength. It attracts beauty, it attracts other wildlife, it gives strength, it is good for the environment. Everybody benefits when we have this kind of diversity. And I'll just let you read that. The value of biodiversity is it makes our ecosystems more resilient. And that's a prerequisite for stable societies. Its wanton destruction is akin to setting fire to our own lifeboat. So while this is about ecological approaches to understanding the environment and understanding the value of biodiversity, I think it applies just as much to language education, that language education is wonderfully complex, rich and diverse, and that is in fact our strength, and we should be celebrating that. It isn't a competition. It's a way of working together, recognizing strengths and finding ways in which we complement each other. So language education is inherently interdisciplinary. I don't really think that that's particularly controversial, although I know for some people maybe it is. But the wonderful Alan Davis was talking about the fact that an applied linguist is deliberately eclectic and draws on any source of knowledge that may illuminate the language of problems. And that is the kind of core of breaking out of your academic silo, if you like, is that as an applied linguist, you have to draw on other disciplines. And these can be linguistics, education, psychology. This conference is organized by different types of departments, looking at psychology, sociology, communication studies, and so on. So everything that we do, in my view, is inherently interdisciplinary, but that brings its own challenges with it. So it is inherent to our field that we want to break down these silos and we want to overcome the isolation within the field and beyond the field. And I'll come back to that notion of within and beyond a little bit later. So to illustrate a little bit of my thinking here, I decided that I would talk about the experiences I've had with PLLT, which stands for the Psychology of Language Learning and Teaching. It's a subdomain within applied linguistics. It's a field and area of its own, and I'll talk a little bit about its heritage shortly. And then I'm going to talk about 3 types of plurality that have impacted my understanding of PLLT, and which I hope will give some inspiration and food for thought for the conference. Particularly knowing that this is an opening plenary, I wanted to pick something relatively broad that will allow people to pick bits out of it that you maybe want to engage with. And I'm going to look at theoretical plurality, methodological plurality, and contextual plurality. And then I'm going to end by looking ahead with my ambitious hopes for the future. So this is where I'm still sat now, 20 years later, I'm still sat, my chair has changed, I've got a better chair now, and I've also got a better desk. but the room is the same, as you perhaps can't see, but it's the same room that I'm in at the moment. I no longer have quite that mess on my floor because this was the days when I was writing my PhD that you had to print out your articles. You didn't have them digitally. And my fashion sense has not improved either. That's deteriorated over time as well. But you can see that at the start of my PhD journey, I'm telling you this because I think it is relevant to my discussion about disciplinarity. I started from my knowledge and my experience as a teacher that when I was choosing the PhD topic, I wasn't really very well read. I'd done my master's and I'd become interested in some topics during my master's thesis. But really, I was coming at this as a teacher. This was how I approached my research journey, is that looking at my learners as a language teacher, looking at the experiences I had in my classroom, that was my driving force. And that I had my own experience to draw, and that guided the direction that I went in my PhD. And that has been that experience and that heritage of coming at this as a language teacher has been defining for a lot of my work. And I will come to that in the next slide a little bit more. One of the things that I was looking at in my classroom was that I did some strategy training. This was early 90s. This was a time when strategy was very fashionable. But one thing that I noticed in doing strategy trainings was actually the end of the 90s. One thing I noticed while doing strategy training was that I noticed that my students weren't necessarily improving linguistically, but they were becoming much more confident and they had much more of a sense of the word I know now as agency to make decisions about what they wanted to do in guiding and directing their own learning. But I had no words for this. I didn't have the language to talk about it. I knew what I meant, but I couldn't find the words for it. And so I literally rang a random woman in the psychology department. God bless her soul. She was kind enough to meet up with me. And I said to her, this is what I'm seeing in my classroom. This is what is happening. Is there a word for this? And she said, yes. She said, the word that you're looking for is self-efficacy. And there's a whole theory, social constructivism, social cognitive theory. And there's a person called Albert Bandura. Go read and that will take you. And I did. And that was the start of my journey. But I had a concept, but I had no language to connect to. I didn't have the words for it. And I'll come back again later to that notion that the language is important too. It helps you to connect, helps you to break down silos, and it helps you to bridge those gaps. Now, we're all language teachers, so we know that fundamentally about languages per se, but our academic language, sometimes we make assumptions about that, and I'll return again a little bit to that moment on. So I started on this journey of interdisciplinary work. I started going outside the boundaries of applied linguistics, going outside the boundary of what I was familiar with, and there was a lot of joy in doing that, a lot of learning, a lot of excitement, a lot of new things, but there was also some pitfalls and some challenges. So the key lessons from that PhD journey that I think have shaped my practice since and are going to be and have been defining for some of the things that follow is I have a very deep and lasting respect for teacher knowledge and professionalism. Teachers know stuff. And sometimes in academia, we lose sight, or maybe I think in sometimes it is actually a willful arrogance. I will say that. I think sometimes that is the case. Teachers know things and they know it on their terms and maybe in their language. But I have a deep respect for teacher expertise, teacher professionalism, and trusting teachers to know what is happening in their classroom. And I wish we had much more shared spaces. It has been really important to me in my career, and I've been very fortunate to have opportunities to work in academia and to work in circles with teachers in practice-oriented events. But that comes with its own challenges. You have the risk that practitioners say, what do you know? You're an academic. And you have the risk that academics say, why are you talking about the practice? That's irrelevant to what you're doing. I'm not taking that seriously. So that bridge, breaking down those silos between research and practice is something I've tried to do in my work, but it also comes with an inherent understanding that teachers are professionals with a broad, expansive range of professional knowledge that we would be wise to pay attention to. I found that I needed to know appropriate language. I needed to know if there were words for what I'm talking about. And I have an obsession that I hate it when people create new words for things that already exist. It means you haven't done your work to find out what notions are already out there. But I needed this language not only to position what I knew and to dig more deeply and find out other people who've done that, but you needed to create those connections. How can you build on other people's work, and how can you allow them to find your work if you don't have that shared language and that shared space for communicating with each other? So all language education is interdisciplinary, but perhaps as I embarked on this PLLT journey, the psychology of language learning and teaching, it became clear that I need to read very widely. That meant I was reading applied linguistics education research anyway, but now I was reading all about psychology. And I will confess, I don't know if there's people in the room that are listening, I will confess, this did make me go and do another master's degree in psychology because I was so paranoid that I didn't know what I was talking about. And perhaps I still don't know what I'm talking about, but I at least took the journey to do the two in that way. So PLLT, for those who are not familiar, is an interdisciplinary blend of linguistics, psychology, and education. I don't think it is just that, but those were the ones we picked and focused on for the definition, that examines areas of psychology. Now that wording is important and you'll see shortly why. Enacted and experienced in the context of language learning and teaching. And I'm going to come to another part of that definition later that was important in my growth and development is I started as a teacher. And so the interest of my research was very much on the learners for obvious reasons. I wanted my learners to have a better experience of being in the class with me, and I wanted them to be successful. So the focus of my research was very much on the learning. And if you look at some of the early experiences, PLLT wasn't called PLLT, as you will see, it was called PLL, which was psychology of language learning. But my later developments meant that I really wanted to bring into focus teachers and teaching, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So what's in a name? This I've highlighted this, but there's a series of books that put psychology in the title, starting way back with the wonderful Steve McDonough, Marion Williams and Bob Burden, and then of course the fantastic, wonderful Zoltan Dernier, without whom the field of PLLT simply wouldn't exist. And then we came along with our first attempt at doing this, and this was the first time I experienced resistance from a publisher who said, you don't want to put the word psychology in your title. It will put teachers off. And I was like, what? That'd be ridiculous. Why? That's the word for it. Why would I not use the word that it is? And I have to tell you, I've been having that experience repeatedly over time. Now, I have resisted because of what I've just explained, that I think using the words allows people connection, allows people to talk. And also, I think it's insulting to teachers to think that they would be deterred by the word psychology. I think they know very well what psychology is. So this notion of keeping the term and keeping the name psychology has proven to be a real battle that I have had in multiple contexts, which I'm happy to chat about later, because there is a resistance that, and I think there are also stereotype notions of what psychology is that also causes some problems. But I think we have to embrace the language that we need to talk about concepts, and that it's actually a constructive way of breaking down silos to do that. And if we invent our own words for things when something also exists already, you're actually creating barriers that are unhelpful. So the whole notion of language education is that you want to break down barriers, build connection, and create spaces for people to come together. And that's the same in academic language as well. So the challenges of interdisciplinary work. I'm sure everybody in this room has got their own story about this. And I'm sure if you think about this, you can talk about some of your own experiences. And I'll share some of the issues that we've had, mainly in the hope of illustrating some of the problems of this silo thinking that we still have, and some of the ways that we can perhaps tackle that and engage with that. So Stephen Ryan and I actually wrote a paper about this at the beginning of the sort of development of PLLT as a field, while we were struggling with some things and some of our experiences. And that paper's open access and might be of interest to some of you who are having battles of your own in your own institutions on interdisciplinary levels. So essentially all applied linguistics are working in interdisciplinary space. So this isn't just about PLLT, but I'm going to focus on that because this has been my area of expertise. It means that you need to be literate in multiple disciplines, and that isn't easy. Now, sometimes it's a wonderful opportunity to work with others, but sometimes you do need to do the work on your own, and that does mean being literate in two disciplines. And that means you need to be reading widely in applied linguistics and know what's going on there, but it also means you need to be reading widely in psychology to make sure that you know what's going on there. So that is a real and authentic challenge. You know how it is. I don't know about you, but I get notifications every day of these new papers that have been published, and it just makes me hysterical. In fact, I've switched them off now because I can't read all of that. It's not possible. You can't know all of these things that are going on. And so having that in two disciplines really does create a kind of a stress that you're going to have. So I think there is a genuine pressure that comes with that. This is something I'm going to come to a little bit later about disciplines having different status. It affects the perceptions within this interdisciplinary space about which is the parent discipline and which is the superior of the two. And there are some debates we've had within the field about the perceived relative status of applied linguistics versus psychology. I see them as equal. To me, one doesn't have more status than the other. I probably have a stronger affinity with applied linguistics because it's my heritage, but that's also an emotional and identity affinity. But in terms of the disciplinary discourses and expectations, I suspect that depends on where your priority lies in terms of your work and where you're situated. PLLT, Psychology in Language Learning and Teaching, does not prescribe a theory. It's a field of inquiry. Now, this has been one of the big battles that I've had and some strange conversations it's led to for me, is that when people say, I work in psychology of language learning and teaching, they assume cognition. Now, I think I can trace this back to learner individual differences in SLA. I think that's where that comes from, that learner individual differences in SLA were very typically abstracted, were very typically about cognition, but that isn't psychology. Psychology is a field of inquiry. You can look at it in a social constructivist way. You can have a critical approach to it. You can have an ecological approach to it. You can have a complex dynamic systems approach to it. So nobody tells you how you have to look at the psychology of language learning and teaching. It's a field, and you may look at it in multiple ways. But what it has meant is that within PLLT, there are also some, what I consider very unfortunate silos sometimes that develop, where people have a notion of what PLLT is. So I remember meeting somebody at AAAL, a wonderful scholar who I have the deepest respect for, whose work I love. And I remember saying to her, oh, we've got the PLL conference. I can't remember whether it was in Madrid or where it was. And I said, oh, you must come. It would be great. Your work would fit really well. Because she was researching emotions. And she said, I have nothing to do with psychology. And I was like, what? How can you research emotions and not have anything to do with psychology? I don't understand. She's like, no, I work from a social critical perspective. I have nothing to do with psychology. So you see that notions of the word, associations with the word, understandings of the word have led sometimes to a silo within the field that is deeply unhelpful. And I think also leads to isolation, even within the subfields, rather than actually building bridges and say, wow, I'm working on emotions from this perspective, I'm working on emotions from this perspective, how can we share some of our insights, what can we do together? It isn't a competition. Nobody here is trying to compete with somebody else, say my position is better than your position, oh, my insight's better than your insights. Any insights that help us and help teachers and help learners are great in my view. And it isn't about who has the best theory and who doesn't. And this has been a big problem. This is something we had a lot more at the beginning, has become less of an issue, as you'll see in a moment why, was issues of gatekeeping. So that we would, in the early days, be submitting manuscripts to journal, and they would say, but this isn't applied linguistics. This is about psychology. And we'd be saying, yes, but that is also applied linguistics. This is about language teaching and learning. No, this is too much psychology. It doesn't belong here. So there's also, and that remains for some people in some settings, issues of gatekeeping. And this was a big problem for me at the beginning because it just didn't compute in my brain that people would be so fixed in their borders and their silos that we're thinking. And so it caused me a lot of problems at the beginning of my career and has been a big motivator for why I have engaged in some of the things that I've engaged for. It meant that I felt very strongly that there was a need for community. I felt very strongly that PLLT needed a community and identity because basically strength in numbers. I wanted us to have other people who shared this identity so that we could support each other in making this a thing, so that people would acknowledge that psychology of language learning and teaching as an interdisciplinary subfield of applied linguistics exists. The work was already happening, but it didn't have a name, it didn't have an identity. And that was why that was really important for me to work towards that. But I already recognized that working in these interdisciplinary ways, yeah, there are challenges and there are battles, and you have to become quite resilient, and maybe a little bit awkward. And I'm quite good at that. If I put my mind to it, I can be quite good at that. But it also is a very rewarding and a joyful space when you're looking at things in complex ways and you're learning from other people. It's a lovely thing to do. So this desperate need for community meant that I started with a PLL conference, a psychology and language learning conference. Some of you may recognize some of the people there, the wonderful Sultan and Rebecca, Andrew, Jean-Marc, Marion, Elaine, some lovely people that were there at the time. And of course, next year, it's already going to be in China. We're on PLL6. So it has been growing and growing and growing, which is lovely. We also started the association. That's the actual day we signed the paperwork in 2016. And we've got a book series and we have a journal. And so I think we can safely say that PLLT has kind of come of age. It's got the conferences, it's got the book series, there's community, there's connection. However, while there is this need for PLLT to develop its identity so that people can work in that space with confidence. So one of these issues of gatekeeping and a big motivation behind me setting up a lot of these things with some of my colleagues and friends was that I said, I had no support. No, that's not true. Let me start again. During my PhD journey, my wonderful, beloved supervisor said, I can't help you with the stuff you want to do. Are you sure you want to do this? I don't know about these things. And because I am so stubborn, I said, yes, I definitely want to do this. And he was fantastic in supporting me by saying, okay, do your thing. I will support you. I can advise you on research and writing and so, but I can't advise you on the content. And I felt quite isolated in that experience, but I was happy to do it. I was stubborn. I'd made up my mind. I knew what I wanted. And so I went ahead with it anyway. And that's one of the reasons why I felt that there needed to be community so that young scholars could turn around and say, there is such a thing, rather than being at institutions where people were saying, you can't do that, that it doesn't exist, there's no such thing, that in fact they could turn around and say, look, there's an association, there are conferences, there's a journal, there's a book series, it's a thing. So while there was this need for PLT to exist as a concept, it was very careful that we don't actually then start to do exactly what we had decided we didn't want to do, was creating another silo, that we create PLT as an isolated community. That the whole reason we had come into existence was for this sharing and interdisciplinary space. But stepping back a layer, the irony was we have to be careful that we don't become a silo. And hold on. And the wonderful Diane Larson Freeman, in the very first issue of JPLL, describes exactly this problem. And I'll just let you read what she said. If somebody from the organizing team can also put in the chat box when I'm due to finish, I'd be really grateful. It would just make sure that I keep an eye on my time. So this was the start of the journal. And the wonderful Diane Larson Freeman, with her infinite wisdom and her astute observations, already sensed that this was a risk. And so she, in her first article for this, talks about making this relational and not becoming tribal, as she calls it. Brilliant, thank you. So you see that this was a notion already, even in the first edition. So let me dash on. I'm going to just skip over that and go to the 3 types of plurality. I'm going to highlight these 3 types of plurality as these sort of different ways of looking at theoretical, methodological, and contextual plurality. So theoretical plurality in PLLT, we've talked a little bit about this already, this misunderstanding that it's not a single lens. It can be looked at in many different ways. It's a field of inquiry. So theoretical plurality is at the heart of PLLT, but it has got a history of being dominated by cognitive perspectives in SLA when we talk about it in terms of individual differences. So when I came into the field, if you looked at individual differences in language education, which was the only thing that was kind of close to psychology, very often it wasn't called psychology. It was really just motivation and anxiety, and there was like nothing else really that was particularly looked at. And it was typically researched in a quantitative way. It was typically a focus on cognition, and it was typically a focus on the individual as abstracted, as a mental being rather than a situated holistic being. But PLLT has deliberately, partly due to the kind of work that's been done, some of the theoretical lenses that have been used, and also the kind of, there's a lot of teachers who have embraced PLLT as part of their identities. And so that has led to a natural shift that learner individual differences is one part of psychology, but it's one part, and that PLLT is a much broader church. It involves a diverse range of constructs, a diverse range of stakeholders, which I'll come to in a moment, and it also has meant a lot of different types of theoretical perspectives. Individuals in context with Ushe Oda. So Ushe Oda, when I was doing my PhD, I wanted to do it qualitatively. Again, I don't know why I feel the need to do everything different to everybody else, but I didn't want to do it. I think it's because I was a teacher. And as a teacher, you recognize inherently the messiness of life and the individuality of students and the dynamism of what's going on in the classroom. And so for me, the quantitative just didn't resonate enough with my experience. And Emma Ushe Oda's brilliant work, she was the only person at that time researching motivation from a qualitative perspective. There was nothing else. And so she went on to develop this into the notion of individuals in context. And her work has been very influential for me, but also for many others in expanding this notion of psychology beyond the mental world of individuals and really thinking about the sort of socially situated character of people. Complexity theory was introduced by Diane Larson Freeman, and that resonated very strongly with me personally. And I'll come briefly to that in a moment. It added the notion of context. So in a complex dynamic system, context is part of the system. So that means if you're talking about an individual's psychology of the complex dynamic system, you have to understand the role of context within that. And that means that it's not separate to, but it's part of that. Now, I'll talk about that in a moment as well. But it also talked about dynamism, that things are not static, they change over time, they change over different levels of time, things can change your psychology, your motivation. I can't see you in the room, and it's perhaps as well, and I can't see any of the guests, but your motivation and your interest will change over the course of this next 45 minutes. It's normal that it would. And sometimes you'll be more interested than others, and you'll learn that it's the same. So it was also then to start saying, well, okay, if we look at this, if we look at these nested systems, if we look at the learner in the classroom as being part of a bigger complex dynamic system, you start to realize that looking only at one task can only tell you so much, that there's also the whole class, the whole institution, the whole social context, the whole notion of how the language is treated and beyond. So it started to spread out in terms of more holistic views. Challenge the notion also of boundaries and the notion of domains. Was the domain of language teaching separate to the notion of teaching? And that's something that we've had enormous difficulties with. Can you talk about teaching? If you research, for example, teacher well-being, you will find that many of the issues that language teachers are facing are similar, if not the same, as somebody who's teaching maths. But in terms of gatekeeping, again, if you try and submit that article about language teachers to a language teaching journal, and you're talking about language teachers, but many of the findings are relevant also to any other kind of teacher, I can assure you from my personal experience that you will get a rejection letter saying this isn't specific enough about language teaching. Well, wait, we're back to our silos again. It has to have some, what if in this particular study, there was nothing unique about language teachers. They were in fact sharing so many things with other teachers that there was a lot of commonality. No, it wasn't relevant for the journal and for some journals, and that has been an issue. So when we talk about domain specificity, that's very important for understanding ways in which it may be specific to language education. But we mustn't lose sight of the commonalities we have with education more broadly, the fact that we're part of that community. So I started getting very interested in complex dynamic systems theory. And the irony of ironies about this is that my interest in complex dynamic systems theory did not come from research. It came from my role as a teacher. It came from looking at classrooms and recognizing the characteristics of a complex dynamic system in things that were happening in my classroom. And so it was my teacher identity, not my researcher identity, that took me to a complex dynamic systems theory perspective. But through that perspective, I started to shift and see things a little bit differently. I came to see that if you take the classroom as a social network and you look at the classroom, you see that the teacher is the center of the relational hub. And that if you want to understand the group dynamics, the classroom atmosphere, the way that people work together, you have to understand the teacher. You have to understand teacher psychology. And so the irony is having gone from being very much interested in learners, I started to look at complex dynamic systems theory and thought, well, wait a minute, what do we know about teachers? What do we know about their experience of the classroom? What do we know about their emotions? What do we know about how they're experiencing their professional lives? And then I went back and had a look at the literature, and of course, there was quite a lot about identity, but primarily pre service and early career teachers as they make that transition and develop their identities. Not much about mid career, late career teachers. They were kind of neglected in this. But there was some work on identity. There was also some work on teacher cognitions. So Simon Borg, among others, have done some great work on looking at how teachers make decisions in the classroom, what influences their thinking, their choices, and so on. But all the emotions that you experience as a teacher, I couldn't find research on this. I couldn't find much about this. A little bit of work by the wonderful Elaine Horvitz on teacher anxiety, so looking at linguistic anxiety and linguistic self-efficacy. But a lot that we don't know. So if you think about the massive range of knowledge that we have about learner individual differences, and then you look at teachers and what we know about their individual differences, it's hardly anything. There's virtually nothing that we know. So this journey took me towards language teacher wellbeing, and it became a topic that we started researching with my team in Graz well before the pandemic, which obviously gave the topic a huge boost and has continued to draw attention to it. And I'm just going to show these words again about if you talk about a complex dynamic system, and I can explain very clearly why this made, for me, teaching in a classroom was very much these systems. It was all the interrelated parts. You can't take one bit away and it be the same. It's different if you take some part away. Context is part of the system. Now, this is a complex notion, but if you want to understand me and my psychology, you have to understand my history. You have to understand the environment I'm in at the moment, the relationships that I have, my aspirations for the future. So context is embedded in the person already. It is not just external. It is inherently part of who you are. The notion of emergence is that the state of the classroom, the climate, if you look at the classroom climate, that it's constantly changing, and the mood shifts and the atmosphere changes and people's motivation goes up and down, and then somebody leaves the room and the group dynamics change. This notion of change, dynamism, non-linear and unpredictable, meaning that it's not direct causality. Any teacher will tell you, you go in and you say you do this and they've learned rubbish. You don't know how they're going to learn and how they respond, and they respond sometimes in completely different ways. And that is the joy and skill of being a teacher, is that it isn't easily controllable, it isn't easily predictable, and it isn't very rarely a direct linear causality, do this and that will happen. So this is why, for me, CDST and the complex dynamic system was really fascinating way of looking at the classroom. Its ability to self-organize in ways that are not controlled by an external variable, including also the teacher, and open, meaning that it's also subject, if you try to call something a complex dynamic system, you by nature put a imagined boundary on it because it is open. So it's open to other systems and greater systems. But what Larson, Freeman, and Cameron suggest is that you identify something that functions as a whole. You acknowledge that that's an artificial boundary, but you do that in order to research it whilst remaining mindful of that openness. So if you look at all of that, we're back to the problem of language and the complexity of, if you're working from a complex dynamic systems theory perspective, there's a lot of language there that isn't immediately comprehensible to people. And there is that risk of jargonism, and something that I thought was problematic. But we have that tension, is that we need to avoid jargonistic language that is unnecessarily complex. I have an allergy to people who write in ways that are unnecessarily complex. The more simple and straightforward we can express it, the better. However, words also create understandings, and some of these things need those words. Like I needed psychology in the start of my PhD, I need the notion of emergence to be able to talk about collective and relational constructs and so on. But I then made a shift, and I let go of CDST and I moved to an ecological perspective, and I did it deliberately. So I started researching language teacher wellbeing, and I'm going to have to control myself that I don't talk for hours now about language teacher wellbeing. I started becoming interested in language teacher wellbeing. And once you start researching language teacher wellbeing, it is impossible to not see the important effect that context and culture and system and structure and institution and policy and society, how that affects teacher well-being. And you cannot begin to think of or conceptualize well-being as something abstracted from the social setting. And my concern with a complex dynamic systems perspective was that context wasn't as visible as I would like it to be, particularly because there is a political edge to well-being research, that it is inevitably so. And so I shifted in order to keep some of the characteristics of complex dynamic systems, which ecological perspectives have, but to really make salient so that I can address policymakers and I can address leadership and say, look, if you want to care for your teachers as they deserve to be cared for, and you want to ensure that they're in the best position possible to be the best professional they can be, these are the things in the context that are affecting their well-being and their ability to teach. These are the things that need addressing. So that choice was a deliberate choice, and that was a deliberate positioning. But of course, what that's also done has made me step back and look at the broader ecology of language teaching. And that's now taken me to look at language teacher educators as part of the broader language teacher education ecology. Did you know that apparently the average teacher affects over 3,000 students during their career? That's a lot. Now just imagine with the cascade effect in teacher education. If you're a teacher educator, think how many children's lives you may have affected through the students you have taught. So 3,000 times 3,000, my goodness, you might have affected 9 million children's lives through how you teach. So you can imagine for me that thinking about language teacher educators now as a community, as people with their own psychology, means that that's another area where I think we need to be doing more research. Language teacher educators, many of us in this room, myself, identify as a language teacher educator. I train and educate teachers to become the teacher that they would like to become. And I have inevitably a responsibility and an impact on these teachers and how they come to go into the profession and how they view the profession. And that has an impact down the line on their students too. So understanding language teacher educators psychology is a huge area of research that has kind of grown out of me thinking about the ecology of language teaching and stepping back and thinking about those interconnections. And when we think about this breaking down of silos, stepping back from the language classroom and looking at, whoa, what is it connected to? Well, that takes you back to also the teacher education and the people doing the teacher educating. So methodological plurality, I need to speed up a little bit. Methodological plurality, I think, is just evident. I don't think this is particularly controversial. And the whole notion of triangulation is about the benefits of having a plurality in the research methods. But I'm a little bit concerned, and I'm going to say this very explicitly, that we may be regressing a little bit back to the paradigm wars of the 1980s. Now, when I started my PhD, I wanted to do it qualitatively. And I didn't really have to have that big battle about why. People before me had done that, and I was kind of spared that big debate about why qualitative research had validity. But conversations now in the discourse about big data, evidence-based practice makes me rabid, quite honestly. Evidence-based, fine. Whose evidence? Do we take teachers' evidence, or do we mean a particular type of evidence? Because usually that's what we mean. So I've become a little bit cautious. Well, I think cautious is probably the wrong word here. You can probably see with my face. I've become a little bit cross about the fact that this sometimes feels in some of the discourse that we may be having a little backwards regression here. There's a very strong fashion for mixed method. I think mixed method is a wonderful idea. It's the strengths of different ways of doing research, and I think that's a fantastic way of approaching it. But we do need to be careful that we're not falling into traps of tokenism. Oh, we did an open-ended question at the end, so it's a mixed method study. No, that's not mixed methods research. Different methods can reveal different insights and raise different questions. Again, this shouldn't be a competition. We don't have to go back to the paradigm wars. If we're talking about inclusive approaches to research, and if we are breaking down these silos, surely we need to acknowledge that different types of research add to our understandings. We want that plurality, we want that diversity. We want people asking different types of questions and doing it in different ways. And so far, the strength of PLLT has really been a very strong diversity. And this is in contrast to mainstream psychology, where there's a much stronger discourse pressure to conform and do a certain type of research, and also the traditional SLA learner ID research, which tends to be very strongly driven by a more quantitative focus in research. And I'm also at this point going to mention forms of knowing. If we really are serious about breaking down these barriers and about accepting and including different forms of knowing in how we come to understand language teaching, we have to think about epistemic justice. And there's an explanation here, a wonderful book by Fricker on epistemic justice. It's the exclusion, the silencing, the undervaluing forms of knowledge, and the unfair status of different forms of knowledge. And it's also distinctions made in the authority of different types of knowledge. Now, just think about what I said about evidence-based practice. What are we classing as evidence? Who is given the authority to dictate to others what should be done and on what basis? So I think there is still quite a lot of discourse that needs to be had on this more meta level about this. Who is allowed to speak? Now, you know that I feel very strongly that teachers have a lot of knowledge. We somehow silence the notion of teacher intuition. Intuition is a form of unconscious knowledge gained through experience. Doesn't mean it's always right, but it doesn't mean it's also wrong either. They have a lot of experiential knowledge that we would be wise to listen to and engage with. Hold on, my mouse has disappeared. Certain social groups, how much voice are they given in our community? How much research, how much status is their knowledge given, and their ways of presenting knowledge and their ways of talking about knowledge? And of course, qualitative researchers. I'm saying that very specifically, given some of the regression that I feel is happening on a broader level, perhaps even beyond our community. And then this takes us to participatory research. So where we think about really being partners together, carrying out research with rather than on people, seeing teachers and learners as partners in the research process, including their perspectives. The wonderful example of exploratory practice, which I love. I grew up at Lancaster University, where I did my PhD with Dick Allwright was there. So learners and teachers understanding classroom life as partners. Academic researchers are not even needed. So when we talk sometimes about building the bridge, you know what, they don't always actually need to be working with academic researchers. So we need to get over that idea that we're so desperately important. And broadening notions of research, what do we actually mean by research? So for me, research is about having an inquiring mind. And there are different types of research for different types of purpose, not one type of research. And broadening notions of what research means, if we see it as a form of inquiry, then that opens up notions of what classes as research. But I have to also make some confession here about some of the challenges I've experienced. So we have a wonderful school here in Graz that approached us and said, we'd like to do research with you. Well, that's a gift, right? You get so excited. Wonderful. We're going to do this research partnership with the school. Now, we've been working with the school now for 8 years. And it's a wonderful partnership that we have. But through a very slow and long, painful process, I have discovered that they don't want to do research together. They want to tell me what they want done, and they want us to come in and do the research. And this has been difficult for my soul and my understanding. But I also can't go in and impose myself and say, you have to do participatory research the way I think participatory research should be done. So this has been a dilemma that we're still dealing with. But what is wonderful about it is that they set the agenda. So every year they come at the beginning of the year, we meet and they say, this is the issue that we're facing in our classes. This is the issue that we want to explore. And we have gradually become a little bit more partner-like, but it has been quite a difficult process. And so there have also been great experiences of working with teachers who are already using PLLT in their classrooms and telling us about things that work and things they notice and things that don't work. Now, let me go back and talk a little bit about that. One of the things about plurality is that research now shows very clearly that the more diverse your group, the stronger it is. And there's an example here about why homogeneous groups are problematic, because you just kind of reconfirm each other. And that's one of the problems with these silo thinking. And it's one of my concerns about PLLT is that if we're always talking to ourselves, do we not run the risk of just confirming ourselves and saying, oh, we're great, we're talking about the same things, we all agree on this. that this interdisciplinary space is an opportunity to grow, but not if we then close ourselves off to other areas and other aspects and we become so unique in our identity that we can't mix with others. The more we learn from other people, the more we are conscious of our academic humility and our willingness to engage and listen to others, the more opportunity there is to learn. And so it's also been an important lesson for me in thinking about the composition of my research teams and understanding truly, not as tokenism, but truly that the more diverse my team is, the better it is. The more we learn from each other, the more we support, the more perspectives we bring, and the better the research we do as a team. So hurtling towards the end, context. Which languages? Okay, this is a bit of a no-brainer that TESOL, of course, still dominates in PLLT and beyond, I think, in wider applied linguistics. That's not new news. Even within the LOTs, there is a distinction in the status of different languages and how they're researched, how they're talked about, and the position that they're given in the discourse. So I think there's a lot still to be done in inclusive terms about building the bridges across different languages and creating a welcoming space for diverse languages. And also specifically, an interesting develop from my point of view is that if we do engage with this multilingual turn, that many people in the world are multilingual. And I had a wonderful conversation with a colleague who I've seen is here today about the notion of multilingualism and what it means to be multilingual. And that multilingual for me is when you learn two languages, when you've got one more language than your own. So whatever your home language is, if you have one home language, let's assume, and another language. So even two languages for me is multilingual already. I know it's not for everybody, but it would be for me. And plurilingual blurs all those boundaries even more. It's one person with various languages. They don't even need to be separated. But what this means for psychology is that we have to think deeply about how we talk about the psychology of learning different languages and motivations, because if you are plurilingual or multilingual, depending on your perspective, those languages relate to each other and also in psychological terms, and your identity in one is usually related to your identity in the other, and your identity is about languages per se, and your motivation in one is related to your motivation in the others. So when we're researching psychology and we're looking at one language, if there are other languages in this person's repertoire, then maybe we're not actually getting a full picture. Maybe we're creating a linguistic silo that isn't authentically experienced as such by the person. And so maybe that is another example of problems. And also from a professor's point of view, from my professor point of view, sometimes disciplines keep people in their silo. So my university wants me to research EFL. And if I research other languages and multilingualism, they say, well, that's very nice, but make sure you do enough on EFL. So sometimes structural expectations put an unhealthy boundary on your identity. We've also been working on a book bringing these two together, so interdisciplinary approaches to psychology of multilingual learners and teachers. So deliberately trying to bring together people who identify first and foremost as multilingual scholars and those who identify first and foremost as PLLT scholars. And that has been a real challenge for all of us because it means that we have to interrogate notions of PLLT with what it means if we're researching multilingualism in a PLLT space. But also for multilingual scholars, that there's a need to learn the language and discourse and scholarship of PLLT to be able to apply it in the multilingual space. So this has been a really exciting project, but also fraught with a lot of challenges, but also a lot of learning and growth as well. Looking also at the countries of research, I still think we obviously have this dominant perspective on weird countries, and this is very strong in psychology research, also in mainstream psychology, that there is still a strong dominance of weird settings, and relatively less visible as the work that's coming from Global South, heritage minority language communities, indigenous communities, and so on. And so this takes me to the question of, I know that PLLT have a huge community in Iran, China, Turkey, Latin America, but is all that work really being heard and seen and cited more broadly? And then I'll come to that in a minute. And then also with whom? So obviously the academic convenience sample, many people research tertiary learners typically. I think that's not just a problem in PLLT, that's a problem in our field generally. We tend not to look at diverse sets of learners very often. So young learners particularly have been neglected, and those with special educational needs. The teacher as being worthy in their own right, I think that is changing, but also still some to do. What about teachers who work in less typical settings, so informal education beyond the classroom? I saw a brilliant study the other week about teachers teaching languages in prisons. Fascinating research, but really important lessons for people working in other settings about understanding that diversity and that specific context notions. And then, as I mentioned earlier, teacher educators and academics, we're also part of that ecology. We're also not separate. So if you look at a language school in a secondary school in Austria, it is not completely separate from those in the teacher education program. And if we want to break down those silos and understand how we can help and support each other, we need to bring that diversity and that dialogue together. 5 more minutes. So I'm just shall I not? Shall I? Yeah, I will. I'm not going to go into the study too much, but if we're talking also about diversity, I want to tell you just briefly, we did a study looking at professors who identify as women who are working in the field of TESOL. And we wanted to find out, we deliberately chose professors because we wanted to understand their experiences throughout their career trajectory. And we wanted to understand how they were experiencing gender discrimination and whether it still was an issue or not. And we had professors from all over the globe, literally every continent, perhaps not Antarctica, but every continent. And it will be no big surprise to anybody that gender discrimination was still an issue and they were still facing that, and that wasn't a problem. But something that came up very strongly was a little bit of a surprise, and I'm just going to let you read it for a second. I'm sure there's some people in the room laughing or shaking their head or saying, oh yeah, don't I know it? In all of the cases, uh, all of these women professors said that the bigger problem for them was not just gender, but was that they were discriminated against because they were working in TESOL or teacher education, and that their discipline, the status of their discipline, was giving them greater problems in their professional lives than their gender. And so if we come back to this notion of silos and separation and power and hierarchy and status, there is a lot more to be said about breaking down barriers and about understanding that there are these power plays also within our field and within our field related to things like arts and humanities or wherever else you may be positioned. I talked a little bit about voice and being heard, so I'm also keen that we have spaces where we share our work, that we have cross-fertilization with across disciplines. We tend to publish in our own journals, which are read by our own population, and we have a problem of silo reading. Silo reading and silo publishing, I think, is a problem that is particularly prevalent in our field and all fields. I would be keen to foster more open scholarship, and there's been a great development in this regard, post-print prejudice, for example, open access journals, to make sure that people have access. And this conference is a wonderful example of having no conference fee, so ensuring that people have access to this. And I would very much want to break down this practice research divide, having shared conferences such as this, which are funded by the unis, different forms of communication, alternative forms such as TESOL graphics, and thinking about these problems I've spoken about of domain specificity, university expectations, what your job description is and what they expect, a lack of these interdisciplinary intercourse spaces, and who is cited and who not and why. And that stretches through languages, but also through location, through opportunity. And I hate to tell you from the research we've done, also maybe through gender as well, but that would be another conversation. So taking us to the very end now, looking ahead for PLT and beyond, I think there's a great opportunity. I think we need to all do our bit, that if we really want to break down these silos, if we want that wonderful diversity, we need to create more opportunities and spaces to engage with each other. We need to create spaces like a dating agency where we can match and mix up with different people, but I've still put, be mindful of your well-being, be careful you don't try to do too much. Looking for participatory, collaborative and community-based methodologies, adding voices to our forms of knowing, making sure that forms of knowing are respectful of different ways of understanding and experiencing the world. Finding diverse ways to communicate and engage with different audiences. My particular passion, making sure that we talk with and we learn from teachers, that it's a two-way flow. The academics are not talking to teachers, but we're learning from teachers. They have a lot to teach us. Trying to engage in open scholarship where possible for global equity and accessibility. Embracing uncertainty and humility. You don't have to know everything. It's wonderful when you don't. It's wonderful when you have the opportunity to go on a journey of learning. We know that that contributes to your well-being as well. And keeping our passion and curiosity about other ways of doing and being in our profession. So if you look at this picture, sometimes I admit that that bottom picture, I wish my garden did look like that sometimes, I have to confess. But I know that the first one is a little bit messier, a little bit not quite those neat boundaries, certainly not those kind of silos, but it's much richer in wildlife. It's much more diverse. It's much more empowering for everybody. And really, I would like that first garden to be what language education looks like. We want to explicitly and actively nurture our diversity in the theories that we engage with, the methods we use, and the contexts that we engage with if we really want a sustainable future for the field. It means that we need to ensure that everybody and their work and their insights and their knowledge is made welcome and given space to share. Thank you very much.